Before we begin, welcome to the channel. If you enjoy powerful mafia love stories filled with betrayal, redemption, and unforgettable emotional twists, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us create more cinematic stories that stay with you long after the ending. Now dim the lights, settle in, and let this unforgettable story begin. The day you stop valuing the quietest person in your life is often the day everything you built begins to fall apart. I didn't understand those words when I first heard them. I only understood them months later, when I found myself standing at the head of the longest conference table in the city, surrounded by empty leather chairs that had once been filled with men who would have followed me anywhere. Rain traced slow lines down the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the skyline into a blur of gray light and broken reflections. The room smelled faintly of polished walnut, cold espresso, and the expensive cigars nobody had touched that morning. My watch ticked louder than the silence. 5 minutes late. 10. 15. No one came. The men who had sworn loyalty for nearly 20 years had simply vanished from my calendar, my phone, and my life. One after another, every call went unanswered. Every message remained unread. Every promise I thought was carved into stone dissolved without explanation. Malcolm Pierce finally entered the room, but he didn't carry the stack of financial reports I expected. He carried only a thin cream-colored envelope. He looked older than he had just a month before, the lines around his eyes deeper, his shoulders lower, as if he had been carrying someone else's grief for far too long. He placed the envelope in front of me without sitting down. "She wanted you to receive this only after the first cracks appeared," he said quietly. My fingers never reached for it. Instead, I stared at the elegant handwriting across the front. My name, Nathaniel Cross, written by the woman I hadn't expected to think about that morning, Evelyn. For a long moment nobody spoke. Outside, traffic drifted through the rain below, ordinary people rushing toward ordinary lives while my entire world stood perfectly still. 3 months earlier I had convinced myself I was finally free. Free from a marriage that had grown quiet. Free from a woman who never argued, never demanded attention, never fought for expensive gifts or glamorous vacations. Evelyn had become invisible to me long before she disappeared forever. I told myself she had accepted the end. I told myself adults moved on. I told myself everyone deserved another chance at happiness. Vanessa certainly believed that. She was younger, beautiful, confident, and impossible to ignore. Wherever she walked, conversations followed. Wherever Evelyn stood, people simply felt comfortable. Back then I thought comfort was ordinary. I never realized comfort was priceless until it was gone. The day Evelyn's funeral ended, I left before most of the guests. I barely noticed the neighbors who cried harder than I did. I barely noticed the librarians from the community branch standing together with wilted bouquets of wildflowers in their hands. I barely noticed Gideon Shaw watching me with disappointment instead of respect. I was already thinking about the engagement announcement Vanessa wanted to schedule before the end of summer. It felt like the beginning of a better future. Looking back, I understand that was the exact moment my future quietly began walking away from me. Malcolm slid the envelope another inch across the table. "Open it," he whispered. "You deserve to know why everything is changing." I finally picked it up. The paper felt impossibly light. Somehow, it weighed more than the empire I believed I controlled. My thumb rested against the edge of the envelope for several seconds before I finally broke the seal. The paper inside carried the faint scent of lavender, the same gentle fragrance that used to linger on the sweaters Evelyn folded every Sunday afternoon. I had not noticed that smell in years. Now it filled the silent conference room more completely than the voices of the men who had once crowded around this table. The letter was only 1 page long. Her handwriting was neat, careful, almost peaceful. "Nathaniel, if this letter has reached you, then something has already begun to disappear. It will not happen all at once. The people around you will simply stop believing that your promises carry the same weight they once did. When that happens, do not blame them. Ask yourself who spent years quietly giving them reasons to stay." I read those lines twice before lowering the page. None of it made sense. Evelyn had never attended strategy meetings. She had never negotiated business contracts. She had never sat beside me during discussions that shaped our organization. She lived a quiet life filled with library books, neighborhood events, and children who greeted her by name whenever we drove through town. How could she possibly know anything about loyalty inside my world? Malcolm remained standing by the window, watching the rain instead of me. She asked me not to explain anything, he said. She believed you would only understand after seeing it yourself. I folded the letter with more care than I expected and slipped it back into the envelope. My phone vibrated against the polished table. Another canceled meeting. Another partner postponing without offering a reason. Another message ending with polite words that somehow felt colder than open hostility. I stood and looked across the skyline. For years I believed fear built lasting loyalty. I believed success could be measured by numbers, properties, and influence. Yet none of those things answered a simple question that suddenly refused to leave my mind. Why was everyone leaving now? That evening I drove home earlier than usual. The mansion felt strangely hollow despite its size. Vanessa sat in the dining room surrounded by bridal magazines, fabric samples, and guest lists spread neatly across the table. She smiled when she saw me, but it faded the moment she noticed the envelope in my hand. You have been distracted ever since that lawyer visited, she said. Forget the past. We should focus on the wedding. I nodded without answering. My eyes drifted toward the bookshelf across the room. A small gap remained where Evelyn had once kept a collection of old gardening books. I had never noticed the empty space until that moment. Nathaniel, Vanessa repeated. Are you even listening? I am, I replied, although it was not entirely true. My thoughts stayed with the letter folded inside my jacket pocket. Later that night, unable to sleep, I walked through rooms I had barely entered in months. Evelyn's reading room remained almost untouched. A faded knitted blanket rested over the arm of her favorite chair. An old ceramic mug still sat beside the window, holding dried lavender stems instead of coffee. On the side table lay a library card tucked inside a worn novel. I picked it up without thinking. The edges were soft from years of use. On the back, written in pencil so lightly I almost missed it, was a single sentence. People remember how you make them feel long after they forget what you gave them. I stared at those words until the grandfather clock downstairs struck midnight. Somewhere across the city, another longtime ally quietly resigned from one of my companies. I would not learn about it until sunrise. By then, another piece of my empire had already slipped away without making a sound. The next morning began with a silence that felt heavier than the rain outside. My assistant usually arrived before 8 with a stack of schedules that kept every hour of my day carefully controlled. That morning my desk remained empty except for the cream-colored envelope, and Evelyn's letter resting beside my untouched coffee. The espresso had already gone cold by the time the first call finally came. It was Gideon Shaw. For nearly 15 years he had never canceled a meeting with me. Never once. His voice sounded respectful but distant, like someone speaking across a river that had suddenly become too wide to cross. I cannot make today's meeting, Nathaniel. Something unexpected came up. Before I could ask another question, the line went quiet. 20 minutes later, another message arrived. Then another. Every explanation sounded different, but they all ended the same way. Delayed. Postponed. Maybe next week. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the ticking of the antique pocket watch I had repaired years earlier. Usually that steady rhythm calmed me. Today it only reminded me that something was slipping beyond my reach 1 minute at a time. Malcolm entered without knocking. He placed a thin folder on my desk. These are not financial reports, he said. They are resignation letters. I opened the folder. The first belonged to the director of one of our charitable foundations. The second came from a legal advisor who had worked beside me for more than a decade. The third was from a family liaison who had organized community programs every holiday season. None of them mentioned money. None of them complained about leadership. Every letter thanked me for past opportunities before quietly stepping away. Why now? I asked. Malcolm looked at me for a long moment before answering. Because she is gone. I frowned. Evelyn had nothing to do with these people. Malcolm slowly shook his head. That is exactly what you believed. Before I could respond, he removed a small notebook from his briefcase. The cover was worn, the corners softened with age. This belonged to the community center director, he explained. He wanted you to see one page. I opened it carefully. There were names, dates, and handwritten notes describing scholarship funds, emergency rent assistance, food deliveries, and medical bills quietly paid for families connected to our organization. Beside nearly every entry appeared the same initials. E.M. Evelyn Mercer. I stared at the page without speaking. Malcolm continued in the same calm voice. She never wanted recognition. Whenever someone lost a home, she found temporary housing. Whenever someone's child needed school supplies, she arranged them. Whenever two families argued, she invited them to the library under the excuse of a community reading event. They left talking instead of resenting one another. None of it sounded possible. Evelyn had never mentioned any of this. She had never asked for permission or praise. She had simply done it. Suddenly I remembered countless evenings when she came home late carrying empty cardboard boxes or smelling faintly of fresh bread from the neighborhood bakery. I had barely looked up from my phone before asking whether dinner was ready. She always smiled and said yes. I had mistaken kindness for routine because it never demanded applause. Malcolm reached into his coat and placed another sealed envelope beside the first one. She prepared several, he said quietly. She believed each one would make sense only after the previous lesson found you. I looked from the second envelope to the rain sliding down the windows. For the first time in years, I was no longer certain that I understood the world I had spent my entire life trying to control. The second envelope remained unopened in my jacket pocket all morning, yet it felt heavier with every passing hour. I tried to bury myself in numbers, contracts, and conference calls because that was how I had solved every problem for most of my adult life. Numbers always obeyed. People usually did too. But that day neither seemed interested in listening anymore. By noon I decided to drive across the city without telling anyone where I was going. The streets looked exactly as they always had. Families hurried across crosswalks carrying grocery bags. Children laughed outside a neighborhood bakery. The florist on Maple Street arranged fresh sunflowers beneath a striped awning. Everything felt painfully ordinary, and somehow that unsettled me more than any crisis inside my business. My car stopped almost by instinct in front of the small brick library where Evelyn had worked for nearly 20 years. I had only visited twice during our marriage. Once for a fundraising event and once to fix a leaking window after a winter storm. Standing on the sidewalk, I realized I could not even remember the names of the people she worked beside every day. The front door chimed softly as I stepped inside. Warm light spilled across polished wooden shelves filled with well-worn novels. The air carried the comforting scent of old paper, fresh coffee, and cedar polish. It was quiet but not lonely. It felt alive. Conversations were whispered instead of rushed. A little boy sat cross-legged reading a picture book while an elderly man carefully completed a crossword puzzle near the fireplace. A woman arranging returned books looked up and froze when she recognized me. Her smile was polite, but sadness lingered behind it. "Mr. Cross," she said gently, "Evelyn always hoped you would come here one day." Without being in a hurry, I could not answer. Another employee disappeared into a back office before returning with a small cardboard box tied neatly with blue ribbon. "She asked us to keep this here," the woman explained. "She said if you ever came looking for answers, you might finally have time to see who she really was." My hands hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside were photographs I had never seen. Evelyn sitting on the floor helping children paint bookmarks. Evelyn serving soup during a winter food drive. Evelyn laughing beside volunteers planting flowers outside a veterans center. In every photograph, people stood close to her as though they naturally trusted her. Not because she was wealthy, not because she carried influence, simply because she listened. Beneath the photographs rested dozens of handwritten thank you notes folded with careful precision. One came from a single father whose daughter had received school supplies when he lost his job. Another thanked her for quietly paying heating bills during an unusually cold January. One elderly woman wrote, "You never made me feel like charity. You made me feel like family." I swallowed hard. I had spent years believing leadership meant commanding respect. Evelyn had earned it without asking. Before I closed the box, something else caught my attention. A folded community newsletter. On the final page was a photograph taken nearly 3 years earlier. I stood in the background speaking into a microphone during a charity banquet. Everyone faced me except Evelyn. She was kneeling beside a frightened little girl whose shoelace had come undone. While I accepted applause, she quietly tied the child's shoe. I stared at that image until it blurred beneath my eyes. For the first time, I wondered how many moments like that I had walked past without ever truly seeing the woman waiting for me to notice. When I returned home that evening, the mansion no longer felt like a place I owned. It felt like a museum filled with pieces of a life I had never bothered to understand. Every hallway seemed quieter than before. Every room carried traces of someone who had quietly filled empty spaces without asking anyone to notice. I walked past the grand staircase and found Vanessa in the sitting room, flipping through fabric samples spread across the coffee table. She looked up with a bright smile that faded almost instantly when she saw the cardboard box in my hands. "You went to the library again," she said. It was not a question. I nodded. There were things I needed to see. Vanessa stood and crossed the room. "Nathaniel, you cannot keep living in the past. People are talking. We still have the engagement celebration to finalize. We have vendors waiting, invitations to approve, interviews with the press." Her voice was calm, but there was impatience beneath every carefully chosen word. I looked at the photographs inside the box before answering. "Do you know how many people came to that library every week just to see Evelyn?" Vanessa folded her arms. She was a librarian. That was her job. I almost agreed. I almost returned to the version of myself that measured every human relationship by titles and responsibilities. Instead, I quietly placed the thank you letters across the table. Vanessa glanced at only one before pushing them aside. "These are sentimental notes," she said. "They have nothing to do with your business." Before I could respond, my phone rang again. This time it was the director of one of our construction companies. Another resignation. Another person thanking me for the opportunity before announcing retirement several years earlier than expected. When the call ended, Vanessa sighed. "Replace him. You always replace people." Her answer should have sounded practical. Instead, it felt strangely empty. I remembered something Malcolm had once told me years ago. Positions can be replaced. Trust cannot. At the time, I dismissed it as idealistic nonsense. Now those words returned with uncomfortable clarity. After Vanessa left for the evening, I carried the cardboard box into Evelyn's reading room. I sat in her favorite chair for the first time. The knitted blanket still rested across one arm. The window overlooked the garden she insisted on planting herself every spring, even though professional landscapers had offered to do it countless times. I opened the second envelope with slower hands than before. Inside was another single page. "Nathaniel, you always believed strength meant standing alone. I believed strength meant helping people stand beside one another. One day you will discover that loyalty cannot be purchased forever. It must be renewed through kindness again and again, especially when nobody is watching." I lowered the letter and stared into the quiet room. For the first time, I realized Evelyn never wrote about my failures with anger. She simply described truths I had never been willing to learn. My eyes drifted toward a small wooden shelf near the fireplace. There sat an old ceramic jar filled with folded paper stars. Curious, I opened it. Each tiny star contained a handwritten name and a short sentence. First day of school. Cancer treatment completed. New apartment. Baby finally came home. Dozens of lives. Dozens of celebrations. Evelyn had remembered every milestone that mattered to someone else. At that exact moment, my phone buzzed once more. A message from Malcolm appeared on the screen. It contained only one sentence. 3 more families have quietly transferred their business to Vincent Rourke this afternoon. I looked around the room that still carried Evelyn's quiet presence, and finally understood something that chilled me more than the bad news itself. My empire was not collapsing because my enemies had suddenly become stronger. It was collapsing because the person who had quietly held people together was no longer there to remind them why they had stayed. The following week unfolded with the strange rhythm of a house that looked unchanged from the outside, while its foundation quietly weakened beneath every step. Each morning I arrived at the office expecting stability, and each evening I returned home carrying another unanswered question. Entire departments continued operating, contracts were still signed, and the city still spoke my name with respect, yet something essential had disappeared. People no longer looked at me with certainty. They looked at me with hesitation. Even the pauses between conversations had grown longer. Vanessa refused to notice any of it. Instead, she filled every room with wedding planners, interior designers, photographers, and event coordinators carrying binders thicker than legal contracts. Swatches of imported fabric covered the dining table where Evelyn had once arranged handwritten holiday cards for neighborhood families. Crystal samples replaced the fresh flowers Evelyn used to gather from the garden every Saturday morning. One afternoon, Vanessa held up 2 invitation designs and smiled. "Which one feels more powerful?" she asked. I stared at the gold lettering without answering. "Nathaniel," she repeated. "People expect something unforgettable." Before I could speak, Malcolm quietly entered the room. His expression alone told me this visit had nothing to do with celebrations. "We need a moment," he said. Vanessa frowned. "Everything can wait until after the tasting appointment." Malcolm did not move. "No, it cannot." She gathered her folders with visible frustration before leaving the room. The front door closed harder than necessary, and silence returned. Malcolm placed another report on the table. 5 community directors resigned today, he said. Several scholarship donors withdrew their annual contributions. The neighborhood outreach office is shutting down next month. I looked at him in disbelief. Those programs barely affected our finances. No, Malcolm replied quietly. They affected our reputation. He opened another folder filled with newspaper clippings and photographs. There was Evelyn standing beside firefighters during a winter coat drive. Evelyn organizing volunteers after severe flooding damaged several apartment buildings. Evelyn speaking with teachers outside an elementary school. None of the headlines mentioned my name. Every story focused on ordinary people helping one another. She never asked permission to do any of this? I asked. Malcolm smiled sadly. She asked once. You told her those projects were too small to matter. After that, she simply stopped asking. His words settled heavily inside the room. I remembered that conversation now. I had been reviewing expansion plans while barely listening to her explain a literacy fundraiser. I had signed 3 contracts during the same discussion. I could not remember a single sentence she had spoken. Later that evening, I wandered into the garden as the sun slipped below the trees. The roses Evelyn planted years earlier had begun blooming again. I noticed something I had somehow overlooked throughout our entire marriage. Small wooden markers stood beside nearly every flower bed. Children from the neighborhood had painted their names across them in bright colors. Emily, Jacob, Noah, Grace. Each child had planted something alongside Evelyn every spring. The garden had never belonged only to us. It belonged to an entire community. My phone buzzed again. This time the message came directly from Gideon Shaw. I need to meet you tomorrow. Alone. There was no greeting. No explanation. Only a location and a time. As I slipped the phone back into my pocket, I noticed an old metal watering can resting beside the garden bench. A folded note was tucked beneath its handle in Evelyn's familiar handwriting. I unfolded it carefully. The strongest roots are the ones nobody notices until the tree begins to fall. I read the sentence twice while the evening breeze carried the scent of roses through the quiet garden, and for the first time in my life, I wondered whether I had mistaken visibility for value for far too long. The cafe Gideon had chosen sat beside the old ferry terminal where commuters hurried through every morning without noticing one another. It was the kind of ordinary place I would have ignored for most of my life. The coffee came in paper cups. The chairs did not match. A small bell chimed every time someone opened the front door. Evelyn used to tell me these were the places where people felt comfortable enough to tell the truth. I arrived 10 minutes early and found Gideon already sitting by the window. He looked tired, not from age but from disappointment that had settled into him one difficult day at a time. He pushed a second paper cup toward me before speaking. She always ordered hot chocolate instead of coffee when we met here, he said quietly. She said life already gave people enough bitterness. I looked at the cup without touching it. How often did you meet? Gideon answered. Without hesitation. Once every month for almost 12 years. I stared at him in disbelief. You met my wife every month and I never knew? He nodded. Because she never wanted recognition. She wanted solutions. The words landed harder than I expected. Gideon reached into his worn leather briefcase and placed a thick notebook on the table between us. Unlike the letters Evelyn had left behind, this notebook belonged to him. Colored tabs marked dozens of pages. These are meeting notes, he explained. Every disagreement between families. Every neighborhood complaint. Every business owner who needed help. Every misunderstanding that could have become something much worse if left alone. I slowly opened the notebook. Page after page described conversations instead of confrontations. Community dinners. Scholarship events. Holiday toy drives. Small gatherings held at churches, schools, and the library where people who no longer trusted one another somehow found common ground. Beside nearly every entry appeared the same sentence. Evelyn will speak with them first. She solved these? I asked. Gideon smiled faintly. Most of them. She believed people usually needed to feel heard before they could change their minds. My throat tightened. I remembered countless evenings when Evelyn returned home carrying leftover cookies from school fundraisers or homemade pies from neighborhood families. I had barely looked up from financial reports before asking whether she enjoyed her little events. She always answered with that gentle smile that never asked me to understand. Gideon leaned back and watched commuters pass outside the window. Nathaniel, do you remember the warehouse strike 5 years ago? I nodded immediately. I had always believed Malcolm negotiated the agreement that ended weeks of tension. Gideon slowly shook his head. Malcolm handled the paperwork. Evelyn spent 3 evenings visiting workers' families, listening to their fears, arranging childcare, finding temporary groceries, and convincing everyone that compromise did not mean surrender. I felt the room grow strangely quiet despite the conversations around us. How many victories had I claimed that quietly belonged to someone else? Gideon slid one final folded page across the table. It was a handwritten guest list from a community dinner held almost 4 years earlier. At the bottom, Evelyn had written a single note to herself. Keep reminding Nathaniel that people protect what makes them feel respected, not what makes them feel afraid. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Fear had built my reputation. Respect had quietly built everything beneath it. When I finally looked up, Gideon was studying me with the same expression he had worn at the funeral. There is something else you deserve to know, he said softly. The families leaving your organization are not following Vincent Rourke because they trust him more. They are leaving because the one person they trusted most is no longer here to convince them to stay. I looked out through the cafe window as the first ferry pulled away from the dock, carrying strangers toward another ordinary morning, and for the first time I realized that the strongest leaders are often the ones history almost forgets because they spend their lives making everyone else feel seen. When I returned to the office the next morning, the building looked exactly the same, yet every familiar hallway carried a feeling I could no longer ignore. Secretaries greeted me with polite smiles, but their voices sounded quieter. Employees lowered their eyes for a moment longer than usual before returning to work. Respect was still there. Confidence was not. Malcolm waited inside my office beside the wide windows overlooking the city. He had arranged several folders across my desk, but this time they contained no financial summaries. They held handwritten letters from community leaders, local business owners, school principals, and nonprofit directors. None of them demanded money. None of them threatened lawsuits. Every one of them simply announced they would no longer participate in projects connected to my organization. I picked up the first letter. It thanked us for years of support before explaining that trust had changed. The second described a neighborhood mentorship program that would continue independently. The third ended with a sentence that stayed with me long after I finished reading. Mrs. Cross believed partnership should outlive any single person. We hope one day your organization believes the same. I set the papers down and rubbed my forehead. This is impossible, I whispered. These are community projects. Why would they matter to everything else? Malcolm answered with unusual firmness. Because people do business with people they believe in. Evelyn understood that long before any of us did. Before I could respond, another visitor arrived without an appointment. Caroline Bishop stepped inside carrying a slim leather portfolio. She greeted me politely before placing another sealed envelope on the desk. Evelyn asked me to deliver this one only after the community began stepping away, she explained. She believed this would be the moment you finally asked the right question. After she quietly left, I opened the envelope with slower hands than ever before. The letter inside was short. Nathaniel, if you are reading this, then you have probably started wondering why strangers are grieving more deeply than you expected. The answer is simple. People remember who stood beside them during ordinary Tuesdays far longer than they remember grand speeches on important Fridays. I read the sentence again and felt an uncomfortable memory surface. Years earlier, Evelyn had invited me to attend a neighborhood reading night. I had declined because an investor dinner seemed more important. She returned home smiling anyway, carrying a paper bag filled with homemade cookies that local children had baked for volunteers. I never asked how the evening went. I only asked whether the investor presentation looked successful in the newspaper the next morning. Standing beside my desk now, I realized I could still remember the investor's name. Yet I could not remember a single child Evelyn had wanted me to meet. My thoughts were interrupted by a television mounted on the office wall. A local news report showed volunteers reopening a renovated community center. There was no mention of my organization. Instead, the reporter described how neighbors had united to finish the project after the passing of a beloved librarian named Evelyn Mercer. Several people placed fresh flowers beneath a small plaque dedicated to her years of service. The camera lingered on smiling families, teachers, firefighters, and shop owners standing shoulder to shoulder. I recognized many of their faces. They had once attended events sponsored by our foundation. They were still together. Only now, they no longer needed my name to bring them into the same room. I turned off the television and looked across the skyline disappearing beneath another layer of gray clouds. My empire had always appeared strongest from the outside. Yet somewhere beyond those buildings, the invisible threads Evelyn spent decades weaving between ordinary people continued holding firm, while everything I had believed was unbreakable was slowly unraveling one quiet farewell at a time. The invitation arrived on thick ivory paper with no decoration except a single embossed crest in the corner. Vincent Rourke was hosting a private dinner for community leaders, business owners, and longtime partners from across the city. A year ago, an invitation like that would have been meaningless because everyone already gathered around my table. Now the guest list read like a quiet inventory of everything I was slowly losing. I stared at the envelope for several minutes before placing it beside Evelyn's letters. Malcolm watched without speaking. Finally he asked, "Are you going?" I nodded. I need to understand what he is offering them. Malcolm looked at me with a sadness that felt older than either of us. Perhaps the better question is what Evelyn gave them that nobody else noticed. The dinner took place inside a restored waterfront warehouse that had been transformed into a community event hall. There were no extravagant decorations, no oversized displays of wealth, only warm lighting, fresh flowers, long wooden tables, and conversations that sounded genuine instead of carefully rehearsed. As I entered, dozens of familiar faces turned toward me. Many had once attended events organized by our foundation. They greeted me politely, but something had changed. Their smiles carried gratitude for the past, rather than confidence in the future. Vincent crossed the room and offered a firm handshake. "Nathaniel," he said with calm courtesy, "I am glad you came." I searched his expression for triumph but found none. He did not look like a man celebrating another person's decline. He looked like someone accepting responsibilities that had quietly become available. During dinner I listened far more than I spoke. Teachers discussed scholarship programs. Restaurant owners organized food drives before winter. Contractors volunteered equipment for neighborhood repairs. Small business owners offered apprenticeships to high school graduates. Again and again, I heard Evelyn's name spoken naturally, almost casually, as though everyone assumed the others already understood her importance. She always remembered birthdays. One elderly woman laughed softly. She called my husband every anniversary after his memory started fading, another guest added. A firefighter smiled while stirring his coffee. She made our station feel appreciated every Christmas without ever asking for photographs. None of these stories involved wealth or influence. They involved presence. They involved showing up. I realized with growing discomfort that I had spent decades believing power was measured by how many people answered my calls. Evelyn had measured life by how many people felt less alone after speaking with her. As dessert was served, Vincent quietly took the seat beside me. "You think I won because your organization weakened," he said. "That is not what happened." I looked at him without answering. He folded a linen napkin carefully before continuing. "People did not leave you for me. They drifted away because the person who reminded them why they belonged disappeared. And nobody replaced her." His words echoed almost perfectly with everything Malcolm and Gideon had already tried to tell me. Before leaving, Vincent handed me a small envelope. "This was found after one of Evelyn's volunteer meetings several years ago," he explained. "She asked that it be returned to you someday if the opportunity ever came." Inside was a simple photograph. Evelyn stood in front of a crowded community center, holding nothing more valuable than a clipboard and a paper cup of hot chocolate. Around her stood teachers, police officers, nurses, mechanics, students, retirees, and shop owners, all smiling as though they belonged to one enormous family. On the back she had written only one sentence: "Real strength is measured by the number of people who feel stronger because you were there." As I walked back toward my car beneath the cool evening sky, I finally understood that Vincent Rourke had never stolen my influence. I had quietly surrendered it years earlier every time I failed to notice the woman who had been giving it meaning all along. The house was silent when I returned that night. Vanessa had left a note saying she was staying with friends while final wedding arrangements continued. Months earlier I would have appreciated the uninterrupted quiet. Now the silence exposed every memory I had spent years ignoring. I carried the photograph Vincent had given me into Evelyn's reading room and placed it beside the growing stack of letters. The room felt unchanged, as though time itself refused to disturb the life she had quietly built inside these walls. The old clock continued its steady rhythm. The dried lavender still rested inside the ceramic mug by the window. Even the knitted blanket across her favorite chair remained folded exactly as she had left it. I lowered myself into the chair and noticed something tucked between two books on the shelf beside me. It was a blue cloth journal, worn at the edges from years of careful handling. Inside the front cover, in Evelyn's familiar handwriting, were 6 simple words. "Only read this when you are ready." I almost closed it. Part of me feared discovering another truth that would leave me wondering how I had failed to see the woman sitting beside me for so many years. But I turned the page anyway. The first entry was dated nearly 15 years earlier. "Nathaniel looked exhausted tonight. He smiled for exactly 7 seconds before another phone call pulled him away. I missed the man who laughed without checking the time." I kept reading. There were no accusations. No viternis. No attempts to rewrite history. She described ordinary days with remarkable tenderness. She wrote about bringing soup to Malcolm after his surgery because she knew he would refuse to ask for help. She wrote about helping Gideon's daughter prepare for college interviews because the young woman was too nervous to practice alone. She wrote about planting roses with neighborhood children because every child deserved to watch something beautiful grow. Then I reached an entry that forced me to stop breathing for a moment. "Nathaniel apologized today for missing dinner again. He looked guilty, so I told him it was fine. It was easier to comfort him than explain how lonely the table felt." I closed my eyes. I remembered that evening perfectly. I had believed my apology solved everything. I never realized she had protected me from the full weight of her disappointment. Several pages later another sentence caught my attention. "People often believe love disappears because of one terrible day. Most of the time it fades through hundreds of ordinary moments when someone stops noticing the person waiting beside them." My hands trembled slightly as I turned another page. There was a pressed wildflower carefully taped beside the date. Underneath it she had written, "Today Nathaniel remembered the anniversary of his father's passing. He thought I forgot because I never mentioned it. I placed fresh flowers at the cemetery before sunrise so he would not have to carry that grief alone." I stared at those words until they blurred. I had thanked no one that day because I assumed the flowers had been arranged by my staff. Another memory collapsed beneath the truth. Another kindness I had accepted without ever asking where it came from. When I finally reached the last completed entry, there were only 2 short sentences. "If Nathaniel ever reads these pages, I hope he does not waste time punishing himself. I only hope he learns to see people while they are still standing beside him." I gently closed the journal and rested my hand across its cover. For the first time since everything had begun falling apart, I understood that the greatest loss in my life was not the influence, the partnerships, or the empire slowly slipping away. It was the years I could never reclaim with the woman who had quietly loved me even when I stopped paying attention. The next morning I canceled the engagement announcement. I did not issue a public statement. I did not blame the press. I simply instructed my office to remove every scheduled appearance from my calendar. Within an hour, Vanessa arrived at the house without calling. The front door closed sharply behind her, and the echo traveled through the empty hallways that suddenly felt too large for two people. She found me in Evelyn's reading room, surrounded by letters, photographs, the blue journal, and the cardboard box from the library. She stared at everything spread across the floor before looking back at me. "This has to stop," she said. "You are letting memories destroy your future." I remained silent for a moment before answering. "Maybe they are showing me the future I already destroyed." Her expression hardened. "Nathaniel, people are laughing at you. Investors are asking questions. Reporters think you are unstable. You cannot keep hiding in this room reading old journals." I looked toward the window where morning light rested across the rose garden Evelyn had planted years earlier. "Do you know what she wrote?" I asked quietly. Vanessa folded her arms. "I do not care what she wrote." Those words settled into the room with unexpected weight. For the first time since we met, I realized she had never once asked who Evelyn truly was. She only cared that Evelyn was gone. Before either of us spoke again, Malcolm entered carrying a thick folder. He hesitated after noticing Vanessa standing beside the fireplace. "This cannot wait," he said. I nodded. Malcolm placed the folder on the desk and opened it. Several investment partners had officially withdrawn. 2 charitable foundations had become independent organizations. 3 longtime advisors announced early retirement. Every decision had been respectful. Every letter expressed gratitude. None contained anger. They simply described a loss of shared purpose. Vanessa glanced at the documents with visible frustration. "Replace them," she said immediately. "Hire better people. Buy new partnerships." Malcolm looked directly at her before, calmly replying, "Partnerships built only on transactions usually end with better offers." The room became quiet again. Vanessa picked up one of Evelyn's letters and set it back down almost immediately without reading it. "I cannot compete with someone who is gone," she whispered, though there was irritation instead of sorrow in her voice. "This house feels like it belongs to her." I answered before I could stop myself. "It always did." She stared at me for several long seconds. Then she quietly removed the engagement ring from her finger and placed it beside the unopened envelopes Evelyn had left behind. "You are no longer choosing me," she said. "You are choosing regret." She turned and walked toward the front door without another word. I listened as her footsteps faded across the marble floor before the house became silent once more. Surprisingly, I did not chase after her. Not because I had stopped caring, but because I finally understood that replacing one relationship with another had never solved the emptiness I refused to face. Malcolm remained beside the window after she left. "Do you regret ending the engagement?" he asked. I looked around the room filled with reminders of a woman who had quietly strengthened thousands of lives, while asking for almost nothing in return. I slowly shook my head. "No, irraplia unasli." I regret waiting until she was gone to understand what love actually looked like. Malcolm reached into his briefcase one final time and carefully placed another sealed envelope on the table. "This is the last one Caroline asked me to deliver before the final letter," he said softly. I rested my hand on the envelope but did not open it. Somewhere outside, children laughed as they walked past the garden Evelyn had once welcomed them into every spring, and for the first time in many years, I realized that some inheritances are measured not by what a person leaves behind, but by the kindness that continues growing long after they are gone. The envelope remained unopened until sunrise. I carried it with me through another sleepless night, setting it on the kitchen counter, then the dining table, then finally beside Evelyn's favorite chair. Somehow I was afraid that once I read the next letter, there would be no excuses left. Morning light slipped through the windows, painting long golden lines across the wooden floor she had insisted on restoring instead of replacing years ago. At the time I had laughed at the idea of saving old wood when we could afford imported marble. Now those imperfect floorboards carried more warmth than any luxury I had ever purchased. I finally broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded with the same quiet care as every letter before it. Nathaniel, if this letter has reached you, then you have probably started looking backward more often than forward. Please do not stay there forever. Regret is only useful if it teaches you how to love the people who are still standing beside you. I lowered the page and sat in silence. Those words should have brought comfort. Instead, they revealed something I had been unwilling to admit. There was almost nobody left standing beside me. The phone rarely rang anymore. The long conference table that once overflowed with advisors remained mostly empty. The calendar that had once dictated every minute of my life now contained entire afternoons with nothing scheduled. The empire I had spent decades expanding had not disappeared overnight. It had simply become smaller each day as people quietly carried their trust somewhere else. Later that afternoon, I asked Malcolm to drive with me across town. He looked surprised when I gave him the address. It was the community center Evelyn had helped renovate several years earlier. Children filled the basketball court behind the building, while volunteers unloaded boxes of donated books near the entrance. Nobody recognized my expensive car. Nobody rushed toward me asking for favors. It was strangely peaceful. The director welcomed us with a warm smile instead of nervous formality. She walked us through classrooms filled with after-school tutoring programs, music lessons, and reading circles. On one wall hung dozens of framed photographs documenting the center's history. Evelyn appeared in many of them, usually standing near the edge of the picture instead of the middle. She always seemed happier watching other people smile than standing in front of a camera herself. She never wanted her name on the building, the director told me. We offered many times. I looked at the children laughing over board games in the next room. Why did she refuse? The director smiled softly. She said buildings are remembered because of the people inside them, not because of the names outside. As we prepared to leave, a little girl ran toward me holding a folded drawing made with colored pencils. Miss Evelyn told us to make pictures for people who looked lonely, she said with complete sincerity. She said sometimes grown-ups need kindness more than kids. I accepted the drawing with trembling hands. It showed a large tree with colorful birds resting in its branches. Across the bottom she had written in uneven letters, "Thank you for coming." I could barely whisper my gratitude before she skipped back toward her friends. During the drive home, I kept the drawing on my lap beside Evelyn's letter. Neither piece of paper held financial value. Neither could restore what I had lost. Yet together they carried more truth than every contract I had signed throughout my career. As the mansion came into view beyond the gates, I realized it no longer felt like the center of my world. The places Evelyn had quietly filled with compassion across the city had become her real legacy, and I was only beginning to understand that the greatest measure of a life was never how much power it gathered, but how much hope it quietly left behind for others. 1 year later, I found myself sitting on a weathered wooden bench outside the same neighborhood library where Evelyn had spent so much of her life making strangers feel like they belonged. Autumn leaves drifted across the sidewalk, collecting around the flower beds she had once planted with local children. The roses had faded with the season, but the garden was still alive. Someone had carefully trimmed every branch. Someone still cared enough to continue what she had started. I held her old library card between my fingers, its edges softened by years of quiet use. I carried it with me almost every day now, not because it belonged to the woman I had lost, but because it reminded me of the person I had spent too long failing to see. The city around me had changed in ways I once believed impossible. My organization no longer dominated every conversation. Many businesses had become independent. Community programs continued without my name attached to them. The enormous conference room that once defined my life had become just another office. Strangely, I no longer missed it. Power had once filled every hour of my schedule. Peace filled the empty spaces it left behind. Malcolm approached carrying 2 paper cups of hot chocolate instead of coffee. He smiled as he handed one to me. "She would approve," he said. I looked toward the library entrance where families came and went with armfuls of books. Children laughed as they raced one another toward the reading garden. Elderly neighbors stopped to talk without checking the time. It was an ordinary afternoon. Exactly the kind Evelyn had always loved. "Do people still ask about her?" I quietly asked. Malcolm nodded. "Every week. He pointed toward a bulletin board near the entrance. Community events, volunteer opportunities, literacy programs, food drives, scholarship announcements, and handwritten thank you notes covered almost every inch of it. At the very top hung a simple framed photograph of Evelyn smiling beside a group of children holding freshly planted flowers. There was no grand memorial.
No statue. No hay la verdad de Caschen.
Only one sentence beneath the frame. She reminded people that kindness grows when it is shared. I felt my throat tighten as I looked away. A little boy wandered over carrying a stack of books almost too heavy for his small arms. One slipped onto the sidewalk. I bent down, picked it up and handed it back. "Thank you, mister," he said with an easy smile before running toward the library doors. Such a small moment. Years ago I would have forgotten it before reaching my car. Today I understood those moments were the ones that quietly shaped entire lives. I reached into my coat pocket and unfolded the final letter Caroline had delivered several weeks earlier. I had read it many times, yet the last line still carried the same quiet weight. Nathaniel, love is not measured by how long someone stays beside you. It is measured by how much of their kindness continues living inside you after they are gone. If you remember nothing else about me, remember to notice people before life teaches you how deeply you will miss them. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the library card. The afternoon sun slipped through the trees, filling the garden with warm golden light. For the first time in many years, I did not feel like a man sitting among ruins. I felt like someone finally beginning to understand the life that had been patiently waiting for him all along. I looked toward the library one last time and quietly whispered, "Thank you, Evelyn." The breeze carried fallen leaves across the path. Children continued laughing somewhere beyond the garden. And I finally understood that the strongest empire anyone could ever build was never one ruled by fear, but one remembered for kindness long after its builder was gone. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes that love, loyalty, and kindness are stronger than power. Leave a comment below and tell us, what would you have done if you were in Nathaniel's place? Your thoughts inspire future stories, and we read every comment. Until next time, remember, power may build an empire, but kindness is what keeps it standing.